In the winter darkness of 1939, inside a drafty British design shed that smelled of sawdust and cold metal, a small team of engineers gathered around a blueprint that nearly everyone in the Royal Air Force had already dismissed as ridiculous. It was a bomber made of wood in an age of steel, a machine with no defensive guns in a sky filled with German fighters, a design so strange, so unmilitary, that it was rejected before it ever flew. Yet buried in those fragile lines was a secret. Germany never expected a weapon so fast it could outrun the Luftwaffe's best, so precise it could slip through radar screens, and so ahead of its time that it would return from the scrap pile to reshape the air war. And at the center of it all was a quiet engineer named Geoffrey de Havilland, a man who believed that speed itself could be a shield. He just had to convince a world terrified of bombers that looked like fortresses, not ghosts. This is the story of the rejected bomber Germany feared and how it came back from failure to change the war. The idea that would one day shake the German high command to its core began not with a roar of engines, but with the soft crackle of sanded timber. Britain had barely entered the war when Geoffrey de Havilland stood before Air Ministry officials and told them the unthinkable. He wanted to build a frontline bomber out of plywood. The room went quiet. Even in a nation famous for eccentric inventors, this felt like madness. Britain needed armor, firepower, survivability, and yet this engineer was proposing a plane that looked like a sports craft, carried no defensive guns, and relied on nothing but speed to stay alive. In meetings, officers whispered the same question: how could wood survive against Germany's steel? But de Havilland saw something others didn't. Britain's industry was strained by shortages of aluminum and strategic metals. Wood, however, grew everywhere. Carpenters knew it. Cabinet makers shaped it. It could be bent, layered, and cured into a smooth, aerodynamic skin no riveted fuselage could match. And if built right, it could slip through the sky faster than anything the Luftwaffe had. De Havilland argued for weeks, sketching airflow curves and thrust calculations, trying to show them a bomber that didn't fight its enemies, it outran them. Yet almost every proposal came back stamped with the same word: rejected. Those early months were suffocating. The engineer worked late into the night, listening to the distant hum of London's blackout sirens, while he refined a design nobody believed in. Fear pressed down on every desk in Britain then. France was collapsing, the Luftwaffe was rising, and still he kept sketching, driven by a stubborn belief that innovation did not come from copying the enemy, but outthinking them. But skepticism hardened within the Air Ministry. A bomber with no guns? Suicide. A wooden airframe? Impossible. They didn't just dislike the idea, they feared that backing it would be a fatal mistake in a war. Britain was already struggling to survive. Then something unexpected happened. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe began ravaging British industry with relentless precision strikes. Aluminum stockpiles dwindled. Traditional bomber production slowed. The Air Ministry, suddenly desperate for alternatives, reopened old files including de Havilland's Wooden Ghost. It wasn't approval, not yet. But for the first time, someone in authority said 6 crucial words: build one, just to prove us wrong. It wasn't support, it was a challenge. And that challenge ignited the spark the engineer had been waiting for. The first prototype would not be built in some military factory surrounded by steel presses and uniformed inspectors. It would rise from workshops filled with furniture makers, boat builders, and craftsmen who had never touched an aircraft part before. These men worked under blackout curtains, shaping the curved nose, sanding the delicate wing edges, testing glue bonds that had to survive combat winds. Outside, London burned in the Blitz. Inside, they pushed forward with a sense of fierce, quiet defiance. This wasn't just building a plane, it was constructing a gamble. If it failed, the entire concept of speed as armor would die with it. As the airframe took shape, so did the resistance. Critics mocked the project as a waste of time. Senior officers predicted it would splinter apart on takeoff. Even de Havilland felt the weight of that doubt pressing into his shoulders, especially late at night when he stared at the prototype resting in the dim hangar light. He wondered if he was risking his reputation and worse, the lives of young pilots on a dream the world might never accept. But dreams, especially in wartime, grow in the cracks where fear tries to take hold. And when the final wing panel locked into place, The engineers gathered around the wooden silhouette now resting proud. Dawn broke pale and icy over the de Havilland airfield on November 25th, 1940. The kind of cold that stung the lungs and stiffened every bolt and hinge. Mechanics stamped their feet against the frost, watching steam curl from their breath as the strange wooden bomber was wheeled into position. No guns, no turrets, just smooth, pale timber gleaming under the morning light. For months, officers had muttered that this moment would end in disaster, that the propellers would tear the wings apart, that the fuselage would twist, that the wooden toy would shatter on the runway before it ever left the ground. Even Jeffrey de Havilland felt a rare tremor of fear as he stood near the hangar, his hands tucked deep into his coat pockets, trying to steady the thoughts racing through his mind. Every criticism he had endured, every smirk he had ignored, every rejection letter he had tucked away, all of it hovered above the runway now, like a storm waiting to break. Inside the cockpit, test pilot Jeffrey de Havilland Jr., the founder's own son, tightened his harness and ran a gloved hand along the throttle. He had flown dozens of prototypes, but none had the weight this one carried. Not just risk, but the burden of proving an idea the world had already tried to bury. He exchanged a final look with his father, a silent nod that held years of shared work, frustration, hope. Then he pushed the throttle forward. The twin Merlin engines coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life, sending a vibration through the frozen airfield. Mechanics stepped back as the wooden bomber began to roll, slowly at first, then gathering speed as the engine settled into a rising, confident howl. Observers held their breath. Many believed the wings would fail long before liftoff. Some expected fire. A few couldn't bear to watch. But something extraordinary happened. Instead of shuddering, the Mosquito seemed to glide across the runway, its lightweight frame cutting through the air with barely any resistance. At 90 miles per hour, the tail lifted. At 110, the nose floated upward. And then, with a smoothness that stunned every critic on the ground, the wooden ghost rose into the cold morning sky. No wrenching, no cracking, no catastrophic buckling, just a clean, effortless climb, as if it had been waiting all along for this moment. On the ground, de Havilland's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't relief he felt at first, it was vindication. Against every doubt, every dismissal, every insult, the aircraft had taken the only revenge an engineer can offer the world. It worked. Up in the air, the Mosquito astonished even its own pilot. The controls were light and responsive. The frame, despite being made of thousands of layered wood veneers, felt rigid and stable, and the speed was unlike anything he had ever flown. The aircraft didn't fight the air. It sliced through it, whisper quiet compared to metal bombers that rattled and groaned at high velocity. Within minutes, the Mosquito reached altitudes and speeds that surpassed even optimistic projections. Below, engineers began to cheer, some laughing in disbelief, others wiping away tears they pretended were just from the cold. The officers who had predicted disaster stood silent, forced to watch a machine they had nearly killed. Prove them wrong in the most public way possible, but the moment of triumph came with a hidden sting because success invited expectations, and expectations in wartime were heavy chains. Now that the wooden bomber had flown, the Air Ministry wanted more tests, more speed trials, more proof. The pressure built as Germany turned its attention fully toward crippling British production. Every hour mattered. Every delay could cost lives. And the Mosquito, once rejected and nearly abandoned, found itself under a new kind of scrutiny, no longer dismissed, but doubted in a different, more demanding way. Could it be built fast enough? Strong enough? In numbers large enough to matter? The aircraft's next trial came just weeks later, and it pushed both machine and pilot to the edge. The Air Ministry demanded a top-speed test, one that would determine whether the Mosquito could truly outrun the Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and FW-190s. Engineers tightened every bolt, polished every wooden curve, checked every glue joint. This was no longer about proving the plane could fly. Now it had to show it could win. When de Havilland Jr. took off again, he pushed the throttle farther, forcing the aircraft into its highest performance envelope. At top speed, the frame hummed, the wings flexed, and the propeller tips blurred into translucent discs. The testing crew stared at their instruments in disbelief. The numbers were not just good, they were historic. The wooden bomber was faster than Britain's top fighters, faster than anything Germany fielded, faster than almost anything in the world news spread quietly at first, whispered through RAF meetings. Then it reached German intelligence, and wow,